Trial Tuesday, once again, today's topic, the ongoing ethics investigation case involving South Carolina House Speaker Bobby Harrell and Attorney General Alan Wilson. Attorney David Aylor, a man who swept his class president election back in high school, is here to weigh on last week's Supreme Court ruling by the state and what happens next. So, Counselor, welcome back to the program. Walk us through that decision last week by the state Supreme Court, basically that allows Speaker Harrell to once again be investigated for those potential ethics and violations.
Correct. It allows him to be investigated at this point by the Attorney General's office, but specifically Alan Wilson. That decision on the conflict of interest has not been made. So basically what happened when it was in front of Judge Manning at the circuit court level, without making the decision on whether or not there was a conflict of interest for the attorney himself, Alan Wilson, to make the investigation, Judge Manning ruled that in fact it needed to go through the Ethics Committee regardless. That is the decision, only that decision, that the Supreme Court reversed and said no, again, Alan Wilson, the Attorney General's office, is allowed to investigate him outside, of course, of the Ethics Committee. Now it's going to go back to Judge Manning and determine that conflict of interest.
That, of course, the latest ruling, but let's rewind a little bit and go back to the original, not charges, the claims, I guess you could say, that these were ethics violations against Speaker Harrell, basically using his influence in the state to further his personal business.
Right. There's a couple different issues. One is, of course, exactly that he used his influence specifically in regards to a company and business he was involved in, encouraging hospitals to get involved and buy prescriptions from the company he was involved in, and doing it on his actual letterhead as the speaker. That's one of the issues, at least it's come about in the public. There's other things related to some of his finance and campaign spending, which has obviously been a problem with a lot of different politicians over the years, exactly how they spend it, but also just as important how they document it.
Absolutely. Let's talk about these two men, because they're letting this thing, I guess one could say, play out in the headlines, in the press. Clearly, they have a problem with one another that just cannot be resolved. It's going to have to go through the courts, of course. But, I mean, have you seen this kind of thing in politics? I mean, you're a lawyer. These guys are kind of lawyers by trade, too. Is this something where it's now kind of an ego thing, or is this simply both believe that the other is wrong?
Well, I think in the case of Speaker Harrell, he's just trying to protect himself and to protect his liberty, because, you know, these are potential criminal matters, and it could go that far once it goes to the grand jury and he could be indicted. From the side of Alan Wilson, of course, he's going to say that it's purely not political at all, and this is simply what his job is, and his job is to enforce the law against anyone, and no one's above the law. But in reality, you know, is there some sort of ego battle there? I'm sure there is. One thing that's interesting in South Carolina, that is such a dominated Republican state, you do have two Republican figures that are both in very high positions going against each other, where that's not something you often see.
Who is footing the bill for this thing, David? Obviously, to go and have these judges read this and have testimony that's taking away from other state matters, is this something that we as taxpayers need to worry about? Is this something that, you know, is that big of a deal that people should be focusing on this and not some of the other problems plaguing our state?
You know, that's a good question. Obviously, it's at the discretion of any solicitor's office or the Attorney General to determine what investigations they should take and how far they should go. In this situation, they feel like it's a corruption at the highest level in regards to the money spending and things like that, or at least that's what's in the allegations. You know, for the everyday person like you and I, some of it's hard to even understand, much less really care about. So it really isn't up to us. But yes, it is tax dollars that are being used for the SLED investigation, of course, to convene the grand juries and everything that comes from it. Now, on the Speaker Harrell's side, it just came out yesterday that he was actually using campaign funds for his attorneys, which has been done here in the state before, even with the former Governor Mark Sander, now state or House representative. So that's something where you're seeing that's coming from a private side, not from a taxpayer side.
So is he allowed to do that, use that state money for lawyers too?
You know, a lot of people are critical about that, and you know, the law says that he's allowed to use you know, attorney's fees for things related to his office and within his office. So you could argue that defending himself to keep his office would be a part of his office.
Where does this thing go from here? Obviously, you said it goes back down to that lower court. They're going to see if Attorney General Alan Wilson can stay on and really go on that fact-finding mission and go after Speaker Harrell. Where do you think this thing plays out? Do you think the judge says, yeah, there's no conflict here? Or do you think he says, you know what, you guys have been worrying about this and battling over for months now. I think it's time to put somebody else in.
Well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I think it'll be difficult to say that there's an actual conflict, at least from my opinion, from legally looking at it. Oftentimes, what the solicitor may think as a prosecutor in a case or the attorney general is separate from anything that would be needed to be from a standpoint of what would be fair and equitable. That comes from the judge and a jury. So in this situation, if perhaps Alan Wilson has some sort of personal issue, personal vendetta, as long as he's within still the eyes of the law that'll be controlled by the judge, then it's going to be hard to say it's a conflict. But you never know. When they really get deep into it, sometimes there's issues looked at that we're not privy to in the public, which is unfortunate.
If so, where does that chain of command go? Who would take over? The assistant attorney general?
And that's another decision they would have to make. Obviously, the attorney general in some level is just the head of the entire state house. But on the other side of that, when you have the state prosecution, you have so many assistants that actually try most of the cases throughout the state.
All right, we'll have to keep an eye on that one as well. Attorney David Aylor, thank you for your time, sir. We do appreciate that. Great insight right there. And we'll be back with more Low Country Live in just a moment.
Trial Tuesday, brought to you by attorney David Aylor.